Hi, everyone. My name is Russ Weninger. I'm an immigration lawyer with Weninger Jong. Today I'm going to give a presentation on how COVID-19 is affecting Canadian immigration. I'd like to start by giving special thanks to the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, CCIS, for promoting this webinar. I'd also like to thank the Alberta government who provides generous funding to CCIS. I'm very appreciative of that. I've done a lot of volunteer work for CCIS in the past, and so it's wonderful that that organization is being supported by the Alberta government. And I'd also like to give special thanks to my articling student, uh, very soon going to be a full-fledged lawyer, and she's, I think, going to be an excellent immigration lawyer. She helped me prepare for this webinar. To start off, I'm going to try as much as possible to answer questions, but I'm going to save that towards the end. So by all means, send in your questions when you think them up. Send them through the chat feature, but I'll be handling that at the end of this presentation. I'm not going to be talking at all about services that the firm offers or fees or anything like that. I also won't be discussing other areas of law, just immigration law. And at the end of this video, presenting this on YouTube. I'm going to put the full video up on YouTube. So if you happen to miss it, if you happen to have to duck out for any reason, or for that matter, if I have some technical difficulties on this end and have to end the webinar for any reason, what I will do is finish the presentation and then put it on the internet for you to view at a later time. So a little bit about me. My name's Russ Weninger. I'm one of the co-founders of Weninger Jong. I practice primarily in the areas of Canadian immigration law and wills and estates. I've been practicing law since 2007. One of the things I enjoy doing is playing the piano. I'm a little rusty at the moment, though. And for years and years and years, I've been trying unsuccessfully to learn Japanese, but it's a continuous work in progress. So that's a little bit about me. So here's a bit of an overview of what we'll be discussing today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we might be able to expect going forward, and I've got expect in quotation marks because we really don't know what to expect at this point. I'll be discussing the travel ban, the halt to removals, some stuff on government benefits that foreign workers and people like that might be entitled to. I'll talk about maintaining or acquiring temporary status, working without a work permit, some strategies for acquiring permanent residence. I'll talk about refugee claims briefly, spousal and common law partner sponsorship. I'll talk about that briefly. And I'll list a few further resources as well. And then at the end, I'll get to questions. So there are three things. Anyone listening to this live stream webinar, there are three things I want you to take away from this. And if you don't remember anything else, remember these three things. In any type of application you're submitting right now, you should be highlighting the fact that these are exceptional circumstances, that COVID-19 is happening, that the economy's in a tailspin, that people's lives are in danger. You should be highlighting those facts. Hopefully you can hear me. Anyways, special strategies. remember these three things. Always highlight humanitarian factors, the special problems facing clients who are or applicants who are applying, um, submitting any type of immigration application at all. Uh, these are special times. There's the potential for people to die. There's the potential for people to face serious financial crises through this pandemic. So you should be noting that in your application. Uh, you should also be noting that you're someone who would make a good contribution to Canadian society. So you're a good, smart, hardworking person who will contribute as much as possible to Canadian society. You should be making that case and really trying to sell yourself as a good candidate for temporary residence or permanent residence, as the case may be. And what's always important, but it's crucially important now, uh, make sure you dot the I's and cross the T's on any application that you're submitting. You really want to be going above and beyond and really putting effort into any application. Don't leave things out. Um, Answer all the questions. Provide as many documents as you possibly can that are required, and go above and beyond. Uh, uh, there might be some things that you can't provide at the moment, things like police checks maybe, or biometrics in some cases, but you really should be trying to submit a complete as complete an application as possible at this point in time, because there's a lot at stake. Uh, there's a gentleman who was a diplomat for the Japanese government in the late 1930s, early 1940s, I believe. I think he was stationed in Lithuania. His name is Chiune Sugihara, and I've characterized him as the quote unquote patron saint of immigration officers. Um, what Chiune Sugihara did during that time, and this was the time when the Nazis in Germany were rounding up European Jews. And so what Mr. Sugihara did was he issued visas to as many European Jews as he possibly could. And um, and he was doing this despite the fact that Japan was an ally of Nazi Germany. And so he was doing this at considerable risk to himself and to his family. And nonetheless, he managed to issue something like 6,000 or more visas for European Jews to travel to Japan uh, during the war. And he probably saved thousands of lives as a result of that. And afterwards, after the war was over, uh, the state of Israel recognized Mr. Sugihara as I think the title was one of the righteous among nations. So this was one of the highest awards that the country of Israel could give to someone, and so it was a recognition of his exemplary humanitarian contributions to the Jewish people. Um, why I think this is important now is immigration officers, visa officers, they're going to be faced with some tough decisions, and they're going to have to make some judgment calls. And I'm really hoping, I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe they will channel the spirit of Mr. Sugihara and try their best to approve people to see the greater good in um, allowing people to remain in Canada and to contribute as much as possible to the Canadian economy through the ability to work and earn an income. Uh, Lives are quite literally at stake here, and So I'm hoping immigration officers, these officers will take that into account and not just go by the book on everything, not just focus on the strict letter of the law, but look at the spirit of the law and explore their own humanity and try to do the right thing. I'm hoping that's the case. So let's talk about what to expect going forward. It's really hard to say what we can expect. Things are definitely going to be different. Old standards won't necessarily apply. Yes, some things might even be easier, but other things are going to be a lot more difficult. And uh, it's really hard to say, for example, what processing times are going to be like. In some cases, things might go more slowly. In other cases, things might be quicker. Uh, Government priorities will almost certainly shift. Uh, you could have government workers getting sick, getting reassigned, possibly even getting laid off. Um, your your immigration lawyer or your immigration consultant, they might get sick, they might die, they might go bankrupt. Um, Rules might change after the fact. Immigration programs may end up being discontinued even after the fact. Um, so it's really hard to say in this COVID-19 era what things are going to be like going forward. So anything I'm telling you today, take it with a grain of salt. If I say something specific about a particular immigration program or a particular government policy, who knows? Maybe right this very minute, Prime Minister Trudeau or some other government minister is announcing something that completely contradicts what I've just said. So, um, uh, yeah, things are very dynamic at the moment. They're changing, and you should be aware of that. So one thing that's come up recently that affects a lot of people is the travel ban. So in most cases, it's extremely difficult for someone to travel to Canada uh, unless they're a Canadian citizen. And in fact, even Canadian citizens are having a lot of difficulty traveling to Canada right now due to the fact that most airlines aren't flying to and from Canada at the moment. Um, uh, but in terms of actual, legal restrictions, there's this travel ban that's precluding most people who aren't Canadian citizens from entering Canada. There are a few exemptions to the travel ban, however. So immediate family members of Canadian citizens or permanent residents can actually travel to Canada, and they include um, uh, people like parents, um, step parents, spouse or common law partner of a parent or step parent, uh, minor children, spouses, common law partners, uh, even guardians or tutors of minor children. International students, so people who currently have a valid study permit or who have um, a letter authorizing study in Canada from IRCC. Those people can potentially uh, travel to Canada as long as they receive that letter on or before March 18th. Temporary workers, people with a valid work permit or who have a letter authorizing them to come to Canada to work, those people can potentially travel to Canada. Um, Now, some workers are actually exempt from work permits. In some cases, for example, Canada has to rely on firefighters from other jurisdictions, especially during the spring and summer. All sorts of forest fires will crop up. So firefighters from other countries, they can potentially travel to Canada. Um, People in different health fields, it might get to the point that Canada is trying to bring in foreign doctors and nurses if things get very bad. So if that happens, those people will likely be able to come. Permanent resident visa holders are also exempt from the travel ban. So if you currently have a visa allowing you to come to Canada to acquire permanent residence, or you have a confirmation of permanent residence document, you can travel to Canada, or you are exempted from the travel ban, I should say. Other people, diplomats, protected persons, so those are people who have valid refugee status in Canada, and there are some other exceptions as well to the general travel ban. One thing that should be noted about the travel ban is that uh, in many cases, airlines are erring on the side of caution, or what they view as erring on the side of caution, and not allowing people who might actually legally be allowed to travel to Canada. These airlines perhaps aren't allowing them to board planes. I've heard anecdotal cases of that. Um, uh, you know, some officers might be misinterpreting some of the rules as well and denying people entry. Uh, so there are bound to be snags along the way, and so what I'd recommend for anyone attempting to travel to Canada is to have as much information and as many corroborating documents as possible to justify the fact that you have an exemption to travel to Canada. Um, Now, practically speaking, most airlines aren't even running flights to Canada at the moment, so I think it's going to be very difficult at a practical level for people to actually travel to Canada right now. I don't know if you can call it good news, but you know, if there's anything that COVID-19 has brought us, one piece of good news perhaps is that um, people who are facing deportation, they have a temporary stay. Let's put it that way. Um, Removals right now are paused in most cases. Probably till at least I heard the date of April 21st, which is coming up pretty soon. But I suspect removals will be suspended for a while past April 21st, because for one thing, it's very difficult to find international flights going out of Canada. The other day, the airlines announced that they were suspending most flights out of Canada until June. So, uh, so removals, deportations, those sorts of things. If you're currently here out of status, or you've been ordered to leave, um, or the government's taking steps to deport you, you probably have a bit of a reprieve. Um, that might not apply though to people like serious criminals, um, people making refugee claims at the Canada-U.S. border. Those sorts of people might be sent packing uh, fairly quickly. Uh, One thing some people were wondering about was whether or not a foreign worker who's been laid off can qualify for employment insurance. Mark Holthe, an immigration lawyer in Lethbridge, wrote an excellent blog article on that, and so I've linked that blog article. I'm going to link to that in the video description as well, so you can check out that article. But in many cases, if the person has been working in Canada and they have valid status as a worker, they can qualify for EI, employment insurance. So now I want to talk a little bit about how to maintain or acquire temporary status. And there are different types of temporary status in Canada. A person can have visitor status, for example, that doesn't allow a person to do anything other than than visit Canada or be a temporary resident of Canada. There's also student status, which allows a person to study in Canada, and there's worker status, which allows a person to work in Canada. And there are usually restrictions on what a person can do in terms of their employment. Although in some cases, a person may have an open work permit, which allows a person to work in virtually any occupation. Now, you might be in a situation where you have no viable option for qualifying for a study permit or a work permit, and maybe you're even out of status, and maybe it's been more than 90 days that you've been out of status, and so you can't even qualify to extend your stay as a visitor. For those sorts of people, you may still want to apply for something called a temporary resident permit. Now, a temporary resident permit, also known as a TRP, is something that can allow a person to remain in Canada if they have a compelling reason, such as a humanitarian reason, such as, for example, maybe there are no flights back to their home country. Uh, so a TRP is something that can allow such a person to remain in Canada on a temporary basis. And when a person applies for a TRP, they can oftentimes apply for other things like a work permit or a study permit, so that they can not only work in Canada, but they can potentially work or study here as well. Uh, there are other types of temporary status, as I mentioned earlier, worker status, student status, um, and most temporary residence applications, visitor, student, worker, those continue to be processed by IRCC. Um, so you can still submit an application for an LMIA-based work permit if your employer has an LMIA. Um, you can still, if you qualify for a postgraduate work permit, you can still apply for that. If you're a spouse of a skilled worker, you can apply for a spousal open work permit. If you're applying for permanent residence, in many cases you can apply for a bridging work permit. If you've been transferred from um, you're a worker, a senior person, or someone with high level technical or specialized knowledge, and you're working for a company overseas and you're being transferred to a Canadian office, especially if it's a type of essential work, you could potentially qualify for an intercompany transferee work permit. So there are a bunch of different options that may be available to people um, to qualify for some type of work permit, for example. Um, there's a bit of a catch-all as well for people who might not otherwise qualify for a work permit. There's something called a significant benefit work permit. Typically, that's reserved for people who are going to come to Canada, set up a business, be employing a lot of people, being these people will be contributing to the economy by investing in Canada. So typically, significant benefit work permits are kind of limited to those sorts of people, or to people who are contributing in other ways, in academic or cultural ways. For example, top scientists, athletes, musicians, the top of the top. Those sorts of people oftentimes qualify for significant benefit work permits. But in the COVID-19 era, um, economic benefit, I think, could be interpreted more liberally. So, for example, if you're working in an essential service, um, if you simply have a job and you're paying rent, Uh, and if you're not, for example, being a drain on food banks or going and relying on charitable organizations, if you're able to sustain yourself and keep paying rent, keep buying groceries, um, that's contributing to the Canadian economy in a very significant way. And so, I think if you've got a job lined up, especially if you're currently working and you need to renew your work permit, it might be worth arguing that you're you're contributing in a significant way to the Canadian economy. Now, under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations, under Regulation 205A, there's provision for a person to apply for a work permit if they're going to be bringing some significant benefit uh, to Canada. So that's something to consider. Some people may be faced with the prospect of working without a work permit in some cases, and they might be doing this in some cases legally, and in other cases perhaps illegally. Um, uh, in a situation like this, I don't really want to moralize. Sometimes people have to do what they do to survive, to avoid starving to death. All I can say is if you're going to work without a work permit, weigh the pros and cons. Um, if you have enough money to subsist without working illegally, then maybe don't do that. That might cause more harm than good down the road. Um, but if you needed to do it to survive, you know, I can't fault you for that. Let's put it that way. And I'm hoping that at the end of the day, the Canadian government won't fault you for that as well. Now, it should be noted, some work can be done in Canada without a work permit. So the legal test is whether or not you're entering the workforce in Canada, whether you're entering the labor market. And for example, let's say you're a computer programmer and you're doing contract work for a company overseas, and this work can be done entirely from your home office, or from you know, you know, you could be sitting on a beach somewhere with your laptop, so you don't necessarily have to be physically located in Canada. You could potentially be doing this work anywhere. Uh, so that sort of work, in many cases, doesn't require a work permit. So if you're doing consulting work or contract work for some business overseas, for example, and the type of work you're doing doesn't require you to be in any particular geographical location, then you might be exempt from the requirement to have a work permit. Now, in terms of acquiring permanent residence, there is one catch-all option that's available to people, and it's known as a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application. So that's an application for people who might not qualify under other immigration streams for permanent residence. Um, Now, in normal circumstances, the government is very stingy about approving people under humanitarian and compassionate grounds. So you typically have to show that you're facing some sort of exceptional hardship if you're wanting to apply under humanitarian and compassionate grounds. Uh, Now, in the context of COVID-19, however, everyone is facing an exceptional circumstance. You may be from a country where the, the healthcare system is entirely failing, and dead bodies are being lined up on the streets. And if something like that applies to you, then, even though under normal circumstances you might not qualify under humanitarian and compassionate grounds, um, maybe now you do. So, uh, I'd suggest that that's something to consider for a lot of people out there who wouldn't otherwise qualify for permanent residence. Maybe under these COVID-19 circumstances, maybe now uh, you 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 could make an arguable case why you should be allowed to remain in Canada as a permanent residence based on humanitarian factors. Now, that being said, if you can qualify under some other way for permanent residence, that's worth exploring because usually a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application is kind of a last resort. So, for example, if you qualify under express entry, that's worth looking into. So express entry applications, it's a digital application process. It's done entirely online. Um, if you meet the requirements for one of the streams, the federal skilled worker program, the Canadian experience class, or one of the provincial nominee streams under express entry, you should be looking into that. So I highly recommend that people check out whether or not they'll qualify under express entry for permanent residence. Uh, Provincially, sorry, I'll go back. Provincially, the Alberta government has what's known as the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program, AINP, and that's a provincial nominee program that allows people to be nominated by the province for permanent residence. Now, the last I've heard is the government is still accepting AINP applications, the Alberta government. So, um, if you qualify under the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program, if you meet those requirements at this point in time, I'd recommend submitting an application under that program. Um, will it continue to be operational going forward? That's really hard to say. I don't really know. But at this point in time, as far as I know, they're still accepting applications, and so it's that's worth exploring as an option if you qualify under any of the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program streams. There are some pilot programs as well for permanent residence. There's the Atlantic Pilot Program. There's the pilot program for rural and northern communities. Um, for those sorts of programs, I'd say don't get your hopes up. I suspect uh, those those programs are going to lay dormant for the foreseeable future. So uh, so if I were you, I'd be focusing on things like express entry and maybe the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program as well. And maybe you meet the requirements for both, and maybe it might make sense to apply under both as well. Uh, if you do have to submit a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application, uh, you should be referring to Section 25, Sub 1 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And this is the section that allows an immigration officer or a visa officer to exempt a person from uh, what would otherwise be the normal requirements for obtaining permanent residence. Lately, I've been getting a lot of inquiries about refugee claims. A lot of people are asking me if they can qualify for permanent residence through doing a refugee claim. Um, Now, one thing to ask yourself if you're considering doing a refugee claim is whether or not it's a desperation move. And by that, what I mean is, are you making this claim just so that you can get status in Canada. And if you're doing that, then it's a desperation move. If you're doing it, on the other hand, because uh, you're actually a refugee, you're facing persecution in your home country, your life is in danger in your home country, that's a little different. Um, Now, one thing to note about refugee claims is at the moment, in-person hearings aren't happening at the Refugee Protection Division. And that probably will continue for some time, I suspect. Um, and when they do resume hearings, there will likely be a backlog. So if you make a refugee claim now, you're, you're probably going to be able to remain and have status in Canada, get a work permit, and you'll probably be here for some time before you have your actual hearing. Um, Now that being said, if you're not a good candidate for success in a refugee hearing, you're probably facing long-term pain for short-term gain. So you'll get that work permit probably, and you'll have several months of waiting before you get to your hearing. But if you're not a good candidate, at the end of the day, your claim is going to be rejected, and you'll eventually be removed from Canada. It will likely be sometime in the distant future, uh, but if your claim ultimately fails, then that may end up being what happens to you. Now that being said, maybe the short-term gain is more important than the loss of long-term immigration prospects. So, I can't really judge people if they're thinking, well, I need to survive. I can't get back to my home country, and I need to be able to work to put food on the table. I've got a family to support. You know, there may be circumstances where, a person has to make the choice that's right for them, and so I'm not saying that categorically that if you don't meet the requirements for refugee status, you shouldn't do a refugee claim. What I'm saying though is that if you make a refugee claim and you don't ultimately meet the requirements for refugee status in Canada, uh, it will down the road possibly result in your removal from Canada. Now, many people who are living in Canada as temporary residents, as visitors, as students, as workers, many of those people out there have spouses or common law partners who are Canadian citizens or permanent residents, and so they might qualify for sponsorship. And so that's definitely something to consider. So if you're married to a Canadian or a permanent resident and that person is residing in Canada, um, and or if you're living in a common law relationship with someone and you've been doing that for at least a year and that person is a Canadian or permanent resident, um, sponsorship might be an option for you. Now, in most cases, a sponsor should have some sort of economic stability. They shouldn't be on social assistance. Shouldn't they probably should have some level of income. But in these situations with COVID-19, maybe the person who would have been your sponsor, maybe they've lost their job. Uh, you might still want to submit the application um, and add on humanitarian arguments to your application in case maybe the sponsorship part is rejected, but you'll get approved for permanent residence on humanitarian grounds. So that's something worth considering. Even if your sponsor has been laid off, even if they've lost their job, they've run out of EI and they're now on social assistance, maybe maybe you can still qualify by submitting a sponsorship application and making additional arguments based on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. One thing I should note is that receiving EI doesn't necessarily that in and of itself doesn't preclude a sponsor from being a sponsor when it comes to spousal or common law partner sponsorship, because EI is basically insurance. You're paying into it when you're working, so then when you get laid off, you're receiving insurance as opposed to social assistance, if that makes sense. Um, what about the CERB benefit? How will the government treat that if a sponsor's on that? I don't know. Hopefully, IRCC officers will, show a little bit of leniency towards sponsorship applicants in those types of cases. But I'd strongly recommend submitting humanitarian arguments along with your application for sponsorship, though, if the sponsor's been laid off or if they're receiving any type of social assistance. If the sponsor dies, maybe they die from COVID-19, for example, that ordinarily would kill a sponsorship application. So if you want to maximize your chances of qualifying for permanent residence, I would strongly recommend in any type of sponsorship application at the moment making those additional humanitarian arguments. The same thing applies if the relationship breaks down. So ordinarily, if a spousal sponsorship is being processed and the relationship breaks down, well, that's the end of the application. But in this day and age, a lot of people would be in dire circumstances if they were forced to leave Canada. So for each and every sponsorship application, I strongly encourage applicants to submit additional humanitarian arguments along with their application. Here are a few resources that I think might be helpful for people. They're not meant to be comprehensive, but these are a few things worth looking at. One is the IRCC COVID-19 page. I've linked to that. The Legal Professional Education Network, I think that's what it's called, LPEN. They had a very interesting webinar recently. It's more geared towards legal professionals, lawyers, immigration consultants, those sorts of people. But they have a COVID-19 resource page with a good webinar as well. So that's worth checking out. Mark Holthe, who's an immigration lawyer here in Alberta, he's got a blog. He always has tons of useful information on his podcast as well, on his YouTube streams, Facebook streams. So he's worth checking out. And Stephen Murrens, who's an immigration lawyer in BC, in Vancouver, I believe, he's got an excellent blog as well, and so I've referred to that as well in the resources. Now, I had some people send in some questions in advance of this webinar, so I'm going to get to those questions first. And people have been sending in questions during the webinar as well, so if I have time, I'll try my best to answer those questions too. So one question I received was, will temporary residence and permanent residence applications continue to be accepted during this time? And the answer at this point in time is yes. So currently the government still is accepting applications for temporary residence and permanent residence. Are there exemptions to the travel restrictions for immediate family members of a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident? Yes, we discussed that a little bit earlier. So the basic exemptions are to spouses, common law partners of Canadian citizens or permanent residents, children, and parents and step parents and people like that, and in some cases, guardians of minor children as well. Guardians are, it might be someone like a tutor or nanny as well. I think there might be an exemption for those people too. Uh, so someone asked, my temporary residence is about to expire. What should I do? If I apply to extend my status as a visitor, do I need medical insurance? Um, well, so one thing I'd say is it might be worth, if your temporary residence is about to expire, you could submit an application to extend your temporary status, and that's probably worth doing. In addition to that, you may also want to do an application for a work permit, something like a TRP application, a temporary residence permit application with a work permit application attached to that. And you should argue the special circumstances of COVID-19. So you should talk about the fact that you don't want to, have to starve to death. You don't want to not be able to pay your rent. Um, you can't fly back to your home country currently because there are no flights to your home country. And also you have the skills that would be helpful in the current situation. You maybe are working in an essential service type of area, or maybe you have medical experience, or um, maybe there's something special about you that would make you able to contribute in a positive way to the Canadian economy. Um, so, uh, so include that in any type of temporary residence application, and consider applying for worker status, not just temporary status. If you qualify for worker status, you can actually qualify for provincial health coverage, for Alberta Health and things like that. Um, uh, if you're just extending your status as a visitor, uh, yes, I think it's a good idea to have medical insurance. You never know what's going to happen in the next several months. You might be hospitalized. Some people with COVID-19 are spending a month or more in hospital, and if you don't have medical insurance, uh, as someone who's not a permanent resident, or not a work permit holder, or someone like that, or not an international student with valid status, you're going to potentially be paying out of pocket for that. Uh, the government will run a tab, but they may eventually want to collect, and a hospital bill could be in the tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, especially if you have an extended stay in a hospital. So medical insurance is probably a good idea if you can get it and if you qualify for it. Will processing times for permanent residence applications increase? Maybe. It's probably too early to say. Uh, the government may shift its immigration officers to different parts of government. They may prioritize certain types of immigration applications over others. It's really hard to say, but it's entirely possible that processing times for permanent residents will increase. I think a lot of government workers currently are working from home, so that makes it difficult to process applications. Also, certain things that are required for applications, such as immigration medicals, biometrics, police checks, things like that, those might be hard to come by in the next little while. And so those sorts of issues are going to cause processing times to go up and up probably in the long run. So yes, it's entirely possible that processing times will increase. If I already have a permanent residence application in progress, will it be affected if I'm laid off? Um, Maybe. It depends on the type of application. So some applications don't require arranged employment, and other types of applications do. So for example, you might have submitted an express entry application, Maybe you have enough points under the Canadian Experience class. For example, you've already worked for a year in Canada, and you're not reliant on arranged employment points. So if that's your situation, uh, then maybe it doesn't matter if you're laid off. If you're submitting a humanitarian application or you have a refugee claim or something like that, uh, being laid off won't affect your application. However, if you have a provincial nominee application that requires you to have current employment or arranged employment, um, you your application may be affected by being laid off. And so that's another reason to submit humanitarian arguments with any type of application you're submitting. If I'm laid off before I have the necessary work experience for a permanent residence application, is there anything I can do? Um, it's really hard to say. Maybe the government will give you some leniency, maybe they won't. Uh, for certain things like express entry, it's hard to even get your foot in the door if you don't have the necessary work experience. If you have 11 and a half months rather than 12 months, will they let you squeak through in an express entry application? Maybe, maybe not. It's hard to say. For people who are well below the necessary work experience, they might consider doing a humanitarian application, a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application. Uh, what if I can't get a requested document due to COVID-19? How will that affect my application? The government has said that in most cases it's going to give people 90-day extensions to get certain documents, things like immigration medicals, police checks, things like biometrics, for example. Um, so if you can't get that document due to COVID-19, let the government know. In many cases, they'll probably even give you an automatic extension. Um, uh, I suspect will even be extending beyond 90 days, as for the foreseeable future, it might be difficult for people to get immigration medical exams. Um, Doctors in Canada and doctors in other parts of the world that do those medical exams, they might not be doing them for the next little while. Um, so um, so it's quite possible you'll get an extension. Your application will likely be just, you know, in a state of suspended animation for a little while you wait to get those documents, though. Will applying for EI negatively affect my application for permanent residence? Probably not in most cases. EI is employment insurance, so it's not regarded as social assistance for most purposes. Um, that being said, if your application requires you to have arranged employment, it depends on how much leniency the immigration officer is going to give you. So if you lose your job, uh, it may affect your application in some cases. It's not so much the issue of receiving EI, it's the issue of having lost your job. For Alberta Opportunity Stream applications under the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program, if a workplace is temporarily shut down, will that negatively affect an application in progress? It might. It's really hard to say how much leniency EI&P is going to give applicants under those types of circumstances. But it's possible that it might. I can't really sugarcoat that. It's just impossible to say, but based on how AINP has regarded applications in the past, if you're not currently working when your application is being processed, you typically don't qualify under the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program. If a worker is on an employer-specific work permit, an LMIA or a free trade work permit, for example, is there an issue if the worker's hours are reduced to less than full time? Um, Hopefully, the government is going to, uh, you know, be somewhat lenient with people. But yes, there may be an issue with that. It might take longer for workers to qualify for permanent residence, for example, and in some cases they might not meet the requirements at all. So those are the pre-submitted questions. I've got a number of other questions from people. Uh, can I still study while an application for a visa extension is in progress? Jermaine asked that question. Um, uh, so it depends what type of visa extension you've applied for. If you've applied to extend your stay as a student, and you submitted your study permit application, your study permit extension application before your study permit expired, then yes, I think you can continue to study while that application. Elenida, I believe it is, asked if a study permit is stalled because of biometrics, can they have an ongoing application to extend the study permit and apply for post-grad work permit? Um, so that's a good question. For the postgraduate work permit, it would probably depend on whether or not you meet the requirements for a postgraduate work permit. So if you've finished your studies, if you've finished your degree program or your diploma program or something like that, apply for the postgraduate work permit. Um, uh, One thing to note about postgraduate work permits is you can only apply uh, for one in your life. So you may or may not want to use that postgraduate work permit application up at this point in time, especially if you still have studies that you want to do down the road. So it's hard to say what you should do in that sort of circumstances, but yeah, in theory, if you've got a pending study permit application, but you happen to meet the requirements for a postgraduate work permit, you could apply for that postgraduate work permit as well. Um, have there been any changes lately with the postgraduate work permit? Claudia asked that question. Not to my knowledge. The usual requirements for a postgraduate work permit, as far as I'm aware, still apply. Will I receive my work permit on time? I applied March 10th, and work permit will be expiring on June 12th, and I'm currently in implied status. So Jean-Pierre asked that question. Will you receive your work permit before June 12th? Maybe, maybe not. That's really hard to say. If an H&C application is denied, can you appeal? Magno asked that question. Uh, you submit a judicial review application if your H&C application is denied. You can also submit a new H&C application if your H&C application is denied. So there are two strategies. If the officer made a legal error, for example, in rejecting your H&C application, you might want to judicially review that rejection. But it's also possible to just submit a new H&C application. Maybe you have additional humanitarian factors at this point in time that you didn't have when you initially submitted your H&C application. Daniela asked, is it normal to be still waiting for a visitor visa which was applied for August 2019? That's probably not normal, but with the delays in some areas that are being experienced at the moment, yeah, you might still have to wait. And if it's an actual visitor visa, if you're just coming here as a tourist, you're not going to be able to come to Canada. For the travel ban, people who are coming here just for non-essential travel, just as tourists, they're not going to be allowed entry into Canada. Carla asked, how long will IRCC extend the working holiday visa due to COVID-19? Um, so so if you already have a working holiday work permit, you're not necessarily going to get an extension. You're going to have to apply for an extension, and you might want to apply based on significant benefit, as I mentioned earlier. Uh, you might want to apply for a temporary resident permit if you're making humanitarian type arguments for why you should get a work permit extension. Um, but yeah, you're working to get a new working holiday work permit at this point in time. I'd say good luck with that. It's probably not going to be happening. Uh, I could be wrong, but yeah, in most cases, I think people are going to have to find other ways to extend those types of work permits. Um, Teal asked for a clarification regarding bridging open work permits that are not yet approved with the work permit expiring soon. So if you've already, within 3 months of your work permit expiring, you applied for the bridging work permit, you should have implied status. Um, Will receiving CERB and or food bank benefits negatively affect a postgraduate work permit or PR application? Christian asked that question. Um, I don't think so in most cases. I don't think the government has any way of tracking whether or not a person is receiving food from the food bank. Um, CERB, yeah, I offhand, I don't think that would affect, for example, a graduate work permit. And in most cases, I don't think that would affect a PR application. As I mentioned earlier, though, for a spousal sponsorship, if the sponsor is receiving social assistance, that could potentially affect an application. Lee Chang asked, or she mentioned that she applied for AINP under the Alberta Opportunity Stream and is waiting for confirmation. Her work permit is expiring in July. Do they apply to extend? Yes, I would recommend applying to extend. If maybe the employer can qualify for an LMIA, then maybe she can extend on that basis. I think a lot of employers these days, except employers in the agricultural industry and food processing industry and maybe transportation, I think many employers are going to have difficulty applying for LMIAs given the current economic situation. Um, but uh, but yeah, if the employer happens to have an LMIA, then apply for an extension on that basis. Uh, Otherwise, maybe apply for an extension under significant benefit, or apply for a temporary resident permit, or something like that. But I would definitely recommend submitting an application to extend before the current work permit expires. Um, Matthew indicated that there's a PR application in process, waiting on a work permit application. Does he have implied status, um, or should he be applying for a visitor visa? Um, so, so if the PR application's in progress, that doesn't automatically give anything in terms of implied status. You have to apply for something like a work permit or a visitor record extension, or something like that. Um, if he's got a current work permit application that's being processed, then he already has implied status. So probably doesn't have to submit another application for extension as a visitor. If you've applied to extend your stay as a worker, that automatically gives you implied status. Um, Jessica and Lee Chang asked, can I have an LMIA extended? I need my AINP confirmation number and visa expires end of May. I am now laid off. Will that affect the application? Well, if you're laid off, yeah, if your employer's laid you off, they're probably not going to qualify for an LMIA. In fact, I think that precludes them from qualifying for an LMIA. Um, Maybe you could find an LMIA through another employer. Um, Yeah, so it may affect your AIMP application. It's hard to say how much leniency the government will give. Um, Veronica mentioned that her visa is expired. She already applied for a work permit, but won't be able to reactivate her social insurance number once the new visa is received. Can I work during this time? Um, so an expired SIN, I don't really know what that means, but yeah, you as long as you have implied status as a worker, so you've submitted a new work permit application before your current work permit expired, yes, you can continue to work. You can legally continue to work, and I think you just for tax purposes use the expired SIN. Canada Revenue Agency, they definitely want to get your money, so. Uh, they can probably take your payments even if your SIN is expired. Um, the spouse of an international student who is done in April. When do I stop working? Um, so if the international student is eligible, they should consider applying for a postgraduate work permit, and and if that person is able to uh, get a work in a skilled occupation, then this spouse can potentially qualify for a spousal open work permit. Uh, uh, I would recommend in any event, though, that the spouse of the international student should apply for an extension. Maybe do an application based on a TRP. Maybe do one based on uh, significant benefit, perhaps. But definitely apply for an extension before your current work permit expires, and that way you'll have implied status. How long until I get my TRP? Gloriana asks. There are no flights back home. TRPs in many cases take several months. In some cases, they take over a year to be processed. In this situation with COVID-19, will they expedite those applications? Will they drag their feet even more? Uh, it's hard to say. I really don't know. Uh, Crystal asks, postgraduate work permit. She has. She's been laid off. Will she be able to extend this work permit? Uh, I don't really know, but I think it's worth applying to extend anyways. Uh, do a TRP application along with a work permit application, maybe. Maybe do a significant benefit work permit application as well. Um, so those might be possibilities. If you're lucky enough to find an employer with an LMIA, uh, maybe apply based on that too. Um, Carla says, waiting on AINP, visa ending July is a question. Uh, maybe not. It depends on whether or not AINP will continue to process the application for non. Uh, you know, if the government is flexible, that might not be a problem. If they're not, then it could be a problem. Uh, for the Alberta Opportunity Stream with the temporary layoff, will this affect minimum hours? Um, uh, the notes, the video description about that, but yes, it's entirely possible that temporary layoffs will affect qualifying under the Alberta Opportunity Stream. Is it possible to extend a bridging open work permit, Cindy? Yes. So if your permanent residence application is still being processed, it's been delayed, or it's still active, but a decision hasn't been made, uh, and your work permit's about to expire, you can apply for another bridging open work permit. If Carla asks, if you got stuck in another country during vacation, will this affect the AINP process? It's hard to say, Carla. It might. It depends, again, how lenient the government is on that. AOS is required for a current job. AOS requires a current job. How about express entry? Um, uh, some express entry applications don't require current gainful employment, but others do. So it depends on the circumstances. It depends on the stream you're applying under and whether or not arranged employment um, is something you're depending on for express entry points. Um, will a working holiday visa be extended? Um, Not necessarily, uh, but a person might apply for something like a TRP/work permit for an extension. They might also, like I said earlier, apply making significant benefit arguments and use that to apply for the extension. Now, ordinarily, for a run-of-the-mill, worker in a normal occupation, a significant benefit work permit application would be soundly rejected by an immigration officer. But under these COVID-19 circumstances, let's say you're a worker in a grocery store or something like that, or a worker in another essential service, um, uh, you know, a significant benefit application could theoretically work. Um, Maybe clarify that answers coming from other viewers in chat shouldn't be taken as legal advice. Someone is answering them all, and chat's going too fast for me to check. Okay, I think Sunny made that notation for me. That's right. So, any answers from other people in the chat or in the comment section shouldn't be taken as legal advice. Anything I'm saying right now, don't take that as legal advice because I haven't met you, I haven't discussed you, I don't know your particular circumstances. So uh, take anything I say with a grain of salt, and always it's a good idea to follow up with a lawyer. And I would say follow up with a lawyer. You can get immigration advice from immigration consultants as well. Um, uh, with immigration consultants, there's quite a continuum. You have, on the one hand, people with very little knowledge and experience, and people with quite a lot of knowledge and experience, and so you have good ones and bad ones. Um, there seems to be more consistency in terms of competence, I think, among the legal profession than among immigration consultants as a rule. So uh, my strong advice would be to check with a lawyer on virtually anything related to immigration. Uh, Check with an immigration lawyer. Don't just check with your family lawyer or your criminal lawyer or your tax lawyer or so. Check with an immigration lawyer. Um, can I get employment insurance without losing the ability to sponsor? Um, uh, yes, you can. Employment insurance doesn't preclude the ability to sponsor. And can I extend my work permit even if I'm laid off? Um, yeah, in some cases, you might be able to extend your work permit even if you're laid off. You could, uh, apply for, like I said, a significant benefit work permit. Maybe another employer is willing to hire you, and maybe you have some previous healthcare experience, and or you've worked in a long-term care facility in the past, and your ability to work might be in demand in the near future. So yeah, even if you've been laid off, you may want to apply for a work permit through TRP/work permit process, or you might wish to apply for a significant benefit work permit, or if you meet the criteria for some other work permit, for example, a spousal open work permit or um, you know, some other type of work permit, yeah, you might be able to extend. Um, so those are the. Oh, I've got a few more questions. Visitor visa from Andrej. Waiting for approval in young professional. Job starting soon. Will everything stop in immigration? I hope not, but you never know. As far as I know, applications are continue to be processed, but it's really hard to say. Um, how can I activate my work visa if uh, boards within Canada are closed? So I think you're talking about um, uh, applying for work permits. So the offices are, you know, immigration officers are still working. They might be working from home, but they're continuing to process things like work permit applications and things like that. Um, Someone asked, or they indicated they left Canada because of COVID-19, but now their record of employment states that they've quit. Will that affect future applications? Uh, that's a good question. It's hard to say. The loss of employment itself could potentially affect future applications, so it's hard to say. Um, Camilla said, Camilla and Sally, they're trying to apply for a postgraduate work permit. The spouse wants to get an open work permit, but needs to submit 3 months of pay slips as proof. Um, I don't have income. Will this affect my application? Okay. So I think what's happening is someone's applying for a postgraduate work permit, and then the spouse is applying for the spousal open work permit. And uh, and to do that, they have to show that the the other spouse is gainfully employed as a skilled worker. Yeah, it might affect the application if they can't prove that the one spouse is in fact currently working in a skilled occupation. Carol asks, can I extend a work permit, a holiday visa? Um, if so, how long will it take? Um, uh, Working holiday visas, I don't think those are getting a lot of priority these days. It might be possible to apply under a working holiday program, but um, who knows how long that will take, or if it's even possible going forward. You might want to try to extend within Canada through, a TRP process or through something like a significant benefit work permit application. Um, uh, Eva said she's temporarily laid off on a closed work permit through Young Professional Stream. Do I notify the government and submit a new application? Um, uh, well, so you continue to have status as a worker as long as your work permit is still valid. Um, and, and yeah, you could, in theory, submit a new application. I don't think you necessarily have to notify the government that you've been laid off. But um, if you're submitting a new type of work permit application, you might want to explain your circumstances in that new application. Patrick said he applied for express entry, laid off on a closed work permit. Should I apply for a bridging work permit? Um, yes, maybe if you qualify, Patrick. If you are meeting the requirements for that bridging open work permit, then it might not be a bad idea to do just that. Mitzi said her current study permit will expire. She applied to extend, cannot submit biometrics. Can I still stay afterwards? Um, if you've already applied to extend, you have implied status as a student. So you're application might be on hold until you get your biometrics, but in the meantime, you will have implied status. Ricardo asked if he applies for humanitarian and compassionate grounds, can he get a work permit? Yes, potentially. So if he receives what's called first stage approval, so at some point during the application process, when a person submits a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application within Canada, at some point the government says, yes, we think you meet the requirements and we're going to continue to process your application. Usually at that point, the person's eligible to apply for a work permit. But that can take a while. That in some cases, during normal processing times, that might take a year or more to get to that first stage of approval. Under these circumstances with COVID-19, who knows how long that's going to take. Nina asked, can spousal sponsor get yes, the sponsor, as I mentioned earlier, a sponsor can still potentially qualify as a sponsor even if they're receiving employment insurance. Jean asked, can I get my Alberta health card with implied status? That's a difficult one to answer, and it's kind of outside the scope of immigration law. It's more about kind of, what the provincial government will do in terms of providing health coverage to people. Ordinarily, under most circumstances, Alberta Health is very reluctant to issue health cards to people who are on implied status. At least that's been my experience. So, who knows? Maybe in this case, Alberta Health will be more facilitative, but based on past experience, it can be very difficult for someone on implied status to extend their health coverage. Someone asked, do you think it's better to submit my LMIA application now or wait until the employment rate improves? That's a good question. It probably depends on the type of industry you're in. For some industries, agricultural type industries, those sorts of things, I think those applications are still being approved and even fast-tracked, but for a service industry type of job, let's say a restaurant type of job, hospitality type of job, submitting an LMIA application now, I suspect, is it's if your workforce has been laid off and you're not currently really in business even due to the business being a non-essential service, for example. Yeah, in that sort of case, I think the LMIA would probably be rejected. Can we get CERB or EI on implied status? Mark Holthe talks about that a little bit in his article. In theory, you can if you can prove that you're still on implied status. Okay, so those are some of the questions I've received. I've gone over about half an hour actually, so I'm going to stop it there. But I plan on doing this again in the future, and so if anyone out there has a preferred time of day or of the week that they'd like to hear this type of webinar going forward, maybe a Wednesday morning at 10 or maybe some other time, leave that in the comment section. Reach out to me. Let me know what type of topics you'd like to discuss in the future, and what type of or what time of day or during the week might be best for you. And I'll try to make these webinars a regular occurrence. Once again, I'd like to thank the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society for promoting this webinar. I'd like to thank the Alberta government for funding CCIS, and I'd like to thank my student, Sunny Lou JD, who's going to be an excellent immigration lawyer in the future and is helping me tremendously at this point in time, helped me prepare for this webinar, and help to organize questions. Thank you so much for watching. Uh, Reach out to me. Let me know if I can be of further assistance. Let me know what you'd like me to talk about in upcoming webinars. I know this is a very challenging time for a lot of people. It's a challenging time for me. It's a challenging time for my family. You can't help but be affected by COVID-19 right now. And I know it's so difficult for people who are not only worried about COVID-19, but they're worried about whether or not they'll have a job, and they're worried about their immigration status as well. I can't imagine how uh, what it's like to have all those simultaneous worries. So I'm going to do my best to help people out, to provide information that might be helpful to you going forward. But thank you so much for watching, and best of luck with you. Stay safe, and if there's any information that I could provide that might be valuable that you can think of,